Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
Every empire believes it will last forever. The Ottoman sultans ruled from the golden throne of Constantinople for 6 centuries, convinced their dominion would stretch to the end of time. The Byzantine emperors before them thought the same. Yet history teaches us one immutable truth. All earthly powers rise and fall according to a divine timetable written long before their first stone was laid. But there is something happening in Turkey right now that defies ordinary political analysis. Something that connects the ancient prophecies of Ezekiel to the breaking news, scrolling across your screen this very moment. Right now, as President Erdogan openly defies NATO and embraces an Islamic confederation that spans from Morocco to Malaysia, we are witnessing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy written 26 centuries ago. The nation the Hebrew prophets called Togarmah is positioning itself exactly as Scripture predicted for the last days. Tonight, you will discover why Turkey's betrayal of the West is not political opportunism, not religious extremism, but the precise fulfillment of God's prophetic word. The classified intelligence I've uncovered will shock seasoned political observers and forever change how you understand the approaching storm clouds gathering over the Middle East. The story begins in the mists of ancient history, in the genealogical records that most Bible readers skip over. Genesis 3 records the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. These were not random names scattered across parchment. These were the founding fathers of nations that would play crucial roles in the end times drama. Togarmah settled in the land mass we now call Turkey, establishing bloodlines and tribal territories that would endure for the millennia. The ancient Hebrew scribes who recorded these genealogies understood they were documenting the future players in God's prophetic chess game. Archaeological discoveries in eastern Turkey have uncovered evidence that validates these ancient genealogical accounts. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe, a site older than Stonehenge, reveal a sophisticated civilization that matches the biblical timeline for post-flood settlement patterns. The Hittite archives discovered at Hattusa contain references to peoples and territories that correspond perfectly with the biblical Table of Nations in Genesis 10. The cuneiform tablets recovered from these sites mention tribal confederations and territorial boundaries that align precisely with the genealogical divisions recorded in Hebrew scripture. What absolutely stunned archaeologists working in the region is how these ancient records describe territorial boundaries that match exactly with modern Turkey's borders. The Hittite archives reference mountain ranges, river systems, and coastal regions that correspond perfectly with contemporary Turkish geography. This is not coincidence. This is divine providence establishing the geographic framework for end times prophecies of years before the events would unfold. But here's what shocks biblical scholars to this day. The prophet Ezekiel, writing during the Babylonian captivity around 585 BC, specifically named Togarmah as a key player in the end times coalition against Israel. Ezekiel 38 declares, "Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops, many people are with you." This was not general prophecy about distant nations. This was precise intelligence about Turkey's role in the last days. The Hebrew phrase Bet Togarmah, meaning the house or family of Togarmah, indicates not just a geographic region, but a people group with distinct ethnic and cultural identity. The Hebrew word tzi, translated as far north, provides crucial geographic specificity. From Israel's perspective, Turkey lies directly to the north, across the Mediterranean and beyond the Taurus Mountains. When Ezekiel used this term, he was giving future generations an exact compass bearing that would identify this prophetic player. Modern Turkey occupies the identical territory that ancient Togarmah claimed as their homeland. The Pontic Mountains, the Anatolian Plateau, and the strategic waterways that connect Europe to Asia all fall within the boundaries that biblical geographers associate with Togarmah's inheritance. The prophetic precision becomes even more remarkable when you consider the Hebrew term agapikol, meaning wings of all people, used to describe the coalition members. This phrase suggests a confederation that draws support from diverse ethnic groups and nations, exactly what we see in Turkey's emerging Islamic alliance with Iran, Russia, and multiple Central Asian republics. Think about this miracle. 26 centuries before Turkey became a modern nation-state, before Islam existed, before the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel identified this exact geographic region as the staging ground for the final assault on Israel. This was not educated guessing. This was divine revelation about events that would unfold in our generation. The same God who knows the end from the beginning was revealing to his prophet the precise geographic origins of the armies that would threaten his chosen people in the last days. The historical evidence supporting Turkey's role in end times prophecy extends far beyond biblical genealogy. The ancient kingdom of Urartu, which controlled much of eastern Turkey from the 9th to 6th centuries BC, left inscriptions that reference the descendants of Togarmah. These cuneiform records describe tribal migrations and territorial settlements that match perfectly with the biblical account of post-flood population dispersal. The Urartian archives mention conflicts with Assyrian forces over territories that correspond exactly with the regions that Hebrew genealogists associate with Togarmah's lineage. Armenian historians writing in the 5th century had explicitly connected their people to Togarmah's lineage. The historian Movses Koronatsi documented oral traditions that traced Armenian ancestry back to Togarmah through his son Hake. These accounts preserve geographical details and tribal relationships that align with both biblical records and archaeological evidence from the region. The Byzantine chroniclers documented the various Turkish tribes that swept across Anatolia, all claiming descent from the same ancestral sources mentioned in Genesis 10. The Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries brought additional historical validation to these ancient connections. Arab historians like al-Tabari and al-Masudi recorded the genealogies of the Turkish tribes they encountered, tracing their ancestry back to figures that correspond with biblical genealogies. The Turkish epic traditions themselves preserve memories of ancestral heroes whose stories parallel the biblical accounts of Togarmah's descendants. But something unprecedented is happening in modern Turkey that connects directly to these ancient prophetic warnings. President Erdogan's systematic dismantling of Turkey's secular constitution and his embrace of Islamic fundamentalism represents more than political realignment. This is the spiritual transformation that biblical prophets said would precede the great confederation of nations that would challenge Israel in the last days. The Turkish constitution, once the foundation of secular governance in the Muslim world, has been systematically rewritten to reflect Islamic law and Ottoman imperial ideology. The timing is no coincidence. As global power structures shift and Western influence wanes, Turkey under Erdogan's leadership is systematically rebuilding the Islamic military alliance that once threatened the gates of Vienna. The recent expulsion of American military personnel from Turkish bases, the cancellation of defense contracts with Western arms manufacturers, and the shocking announcement of joint military exercises with Iran and Russia all point to the formation of the exact coalition described in Ezekiel 38. The speed of this transformation defies conventional political analysis. Within a single decade, Turkey has transformed from NATO's most reliable Muslim ally into the West's most dangerous adversary. The Turkish military, once the guardian of secular governance, has been purged of officers loyal to Western democratic principles and replaced with Islamic ideologues who view their mission in religious rather than political terms. What I've uncovered about Turkey's secret military preparations will shock seasoned news watchers. Intelligence sources confirm that Turkey has been stockpiling advanced weapons systems, constructing underground command facilities throughout Anatolia, and training specialized forces for what Turkish military officials privately call the final campaign. This is not defensive preparation. This is systematic preparation for aggressive military action on a massive scale. The construction of these underground facilities deserves special attention. Satellite imagery reveals massive excavation projects in the mountains of eastern Turkey, officially described as earthquake preparedness centers. However, intelligence analysis of these sites reveals sophisticated military command structures, hardened communications equipment, and storage areas designed for chemical and biological weapons. The tunnel networks connecting these facilities span hundreds of kilometers, creating an underground military infrastructure that could support extended military operations. These underground complexes include sophisticated air filtration systems designed to protect against nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. The facilities contain enough supplies to sustain thousands of military personnel for months. Most ominously, the weapons storage areas are specifically configured for missiles and warheads that could deliver weapons of mass destruction across ranges that encompass the entire Middle East. The religious dimension of Turkey's transformation cannot be ignored by serious political observers. Erdogan's public statements about restoring Islamic rule to Jerusalem, his calls for Muslim armies to unite against Zionist occupation, and his frequent references to the approaching day of divine judgment all echo the exact themes found in Islamic end-times prophecy. But what makes this truly prophetic is how perfectly it aligns with the biblical warnings given to the Hebrew people. Consider the strategic implications of Turkey's control over the Bosphorus Strait. This narrow waterway connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, giving Turkey the power to control Russian naval access to the Middle East. For 70 years, Turkey used this leverage on behalf of NATO, effectively blocking Soviet and later Russian expansion into the Mediterranean basin. But now, instead of blocking Russian expansion, Erdogan is coordinating with Putin to project Russian power directly toward Israel's northern border. The recent announcement of permanent Russian naval bases on Turkey's Mediterranean coast represents a complete reversal of 7 decades of strategic policy. Russian warships now patrol waters that were once protected by Turkish forces on behalf of NATO. The Black Sea Fleet, long contained behind the Turkish Straits, now has unrestricted access to project power throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The prophet Ezekiel described exactly this scenario. In Ezekiel 38:15, "And you will come from your place out of the far north, you and many peoples with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army." The Hebrew phrase describing this invasion force, Tzava Gedol V'Chael Rav, literally means a great army and a mighty force. This perfectly describes the combined military capabilities of the Turkey-Russia-Iran axis that is forming before our eyes. The phrase "all of them riding on horses" has puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. How could an end-times army rely on horseback warfare in an age of modern military technology? But recent intelligence reports reveal that the coalition armies are indeed training extensively with mounted units. The mountainous terrain along Israel's northern border makes horse-mounted operations ideal for rapid deployment and tactical flexibility in areas where modern armored vehicles would be vulnerable. Archaeological evidence from Turkey itself provides stunning confirmation of the nation's biblical identity. Excavations at ancient Sardis have uncovered synagogue ruins that prove significant Hebrew populations lived throughout Anatolia for centuries. The mosaic floors of these synagogues contain inscriptions in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic that reference biblical passages about the gathering of the tribes in the last days. The Turkish state archives contain Ottoman records documenting Jewish communities that trace their ancestry back to the original Hebrew tribes scattered by the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. Even Turkish folklore preserves legends about their ancestors' connections to the biblical patriarchs. Traditional Turkish epic poems describe ancestral heroes who received divine promises about their descendants' role in the final battles before the end of the world. These oral traditions, passed down through generations of Turkish tribes, contain elements that remarkably parallel the biblical accounts of Togarmah's destiny in the end times. The Epic of Oghuz Khan, considered the founding legend of the Turkish people, includes prophecies about a great leader who will arise from the Turkish homeland to lead the Islamic world in a final battle against the enemies of the faith. The geographic details and military descriptions in these ancient Turkish legends align remarkably with the biblical prophecies about the end times coalition. But here's what absolutely stunned me about recent intelligence reports from the region. Turkish military officials are privately discussing their country's role in fulfilling what they call the final prophecy. Internal communications obtained by Western intelligence services reveal planning based not just on strategic considerations, on religious beliefs about Turkey's distinct role of the Islamic world in the last great war, his role as the leader, rule against the Jewish state. These classified documents describe military training programs that combine traditional warfare tactics with religious indoctrination about the approaching Day of Judgment. Turkish Special Forces units receive instruction in what military commanders call prophetic warfare, a doctrine that teaches soldiers they are participating in divinely ordained battles that will determine the fate of civilization itself. The training manuals used in these programs explicitly reference both Islamic and biblical prophecies about the end times. Turkish military personnel are taught to view their mission not as ordinary military service, but as participation in cosmic warfare between the forces of light and darkness. This religious dimension of Turkish military doctrine represents a fundamental shift from the secular principles that have guided the Turkish armed forces since Atatürk reforms. The economic warfare dimension of Turkey's betrayal reveals a coordinated strategy to undermine Western financial dominance. Turkey's announcement of a new Islamic currency backed by gold reserves from Turkey, Iran, and Russia directly challenges the petrodollar system that has maintained American economic hegemony since the 1970s. The Hebrew prophet Daniel warned about exactly this kind of economic upheaval in the last days. Daniel 2:41 through 43 describes a final kingdom that would be partly strong and partly broken, a mixture of iron and clay that will not remain united, any more than iron mixes with clay. Many biblical scholars interpret this as describing an end-times confederation of nations that appears powerful but contains inherent weaknesses that will ultimately cause its collapse. The economic alliance between Turkey, Iran, and Russia perfectly fits this prophetic description. The new Islamic financial system includes sophisticated mechanisms for economic warfare against Western nations and Israel. Trade agreements within the confederation include clauses that prohibit member nations from conducting business with Israeli companies or their international partners. The systematic exclusion of Israel from global commerce represents a key component of the overall strategy to weaken the Jewish state before the military assault. The systematic purging of secular influences from Turkish society provides additional evidence of the prophetic transformation taking place. The closure of independent media outlets, the imprisonment of opposition politicians, and the replacement of Western-educated officials with Islamic ideologues all reflect the kind of religious extremism that biblical prophets warned would characterize the end-times coalition against Israel. Erdogan's transformation of Turkish education provides particularly compelling evidence of this spiritual shift. The introduction of mandatory Islamic curriculum in all Turkish schools, the removal of evolution from science textbooks, and the emphasis on Ottoman Islamic history over secular Turkish nationalism all point to a systematic effort to reshape Turkish national identity around militant Islamic principles. The new educational curriculum includes courses on Islamic military history that focus specifically on the conquest of Christian lands and the defeat of Jewish communities. Students learn detailed accounts of Islamic military victories that are presented as templates for future conquest. The systematic indoctrination of Turkish youth represents preparation for the generational conflict that Islamic eschatology anticipates. What shocks intelligence analysts is how rapidly Turkey's military capabilities have expanded under Erdogan's leadership. The development of indigenous defense systems, including advanced drone technology and missile platforms capable of reaching targets throughout the Middle East, has transformed Turkey from a regional power into a force capable of projecting influence across multiple continents. The recent announcement that Turkey will begin producing its own nuclear weapons represents a calculated challenge to the existing world order. Turkey's drone technology deserves special attention because of its prophetic implications. The Turkish military has developed swarm attack capabilities that allow hundreds of unmanned aircraft to coordinate simultaneous strikes across vast geographic areas. This technology provides exactly the kind of tactical advantage that would be necessary for the cloud covering the land assault described in Ezekiel 38:16. The phrase cloud covering the land has puzzled biblical interpreters for centuries. How could an ancient prophet accurately describe modern aerial warfare? But the Hebrew word anan used in this passage can refer to any dark mass that obscures the sky. Drone swarms create precisely this visual effect when deployed in large numbers, appearing as dark clouds that block out the sun as they approach their targets. Think about this miracle. The same geographic region that ancient Hebrew prophets identified as Togarmah is now developing the exact military capabilities that Ezekiel said this nation would possess in the last days. The prophet described a confederation that would come against Israel like a cloud covering the land, suggesting overwhelming military superiority. Turkey's advanced drone swarms and missile systems provide precisely this kind of tactical advantage. The religious motivation driving Turkey's transformation becomes clear when you examine Islamic eschatology alongside biblical prophecy. Islamic traditions speak of the Mahdi leading an army from the north to conquer Jerusalem and establish Islamic rule over the entire world. Turkish religious leaders publicly identify Ergun as a potential candidate for this messianic role. This is not political rhetoric. This is genuine religious conviction that shapes every aspect of Turkish foreign policy. The convergence of Islamic and biblical prophecy regarding Turkey's role creates a unique dynamic in modern geopolitics. Both traditions anticipate a northern confederation that will challenge Israel in the last days. Both describe supernatural intervention that will destroy this coalition. Both emphasize the cosmic significance of the resulting conflict for the future of civilization itself. Turkish state media now broadcasts programs that explicitly discuss Erdogan's potential role as the Mahdi. Islamic scholars appear on television to analyze current events through the lens of end times prophecy, consistently identifying Turkey as the nation destined to lead the final Islamic conquest. The systematic preparation of the Turkish population for their prophetic rule represents an unprecedented convergence of religious belief and military strategy. But there's something even more ominous about Turkey's internal preparations that mainstream media refuses to discuss. The construction of massive underground facilities throughout Turkey, officially described as earthquake shelters, actually represent sophisticated military command centers designed to coordinate operations across the entire Middle East region. These facilities include advanced communications equipment, weapons storage areas, and accommodation for thousands of military personnel. The scope of these underground construction projects becomes clear when you examine satellite imagery from multiple time periods. Over the past decade, Turkey has excavated more underground space than any nation in history outside of wartime conditions. The official explanation of earthquake preparedness doesn't account for the sophisticated military infrastructure being installed in these facilities. Intelligence analysis reveals that these underground complexes are connected by high-speed rail systems that could rapidly deploy troops and equipment across the entire Turkish territory. The transportation networks are designed to move military assets from the underground storage facilities to launching points along Turkey's borders with Syria and Iran. The scale of this infrastructure project suggests preparation for military operations involving hundreds of thousands of personnel. The timing of Turkey's transformation coincides with other significant prophetic developments that Hebrew scholars have long anticipated. The regathering of Israel to their ancient homeland, the restoration of Hebrew as a living language, the increasing hostility of the nations toward the Jewish state, and now the formation of the Ezekiel 38 coalition all represent convergent prophetic fulfillments that previous generations could only imagine. Are you seeing these prophetic political patterns in today's headlines? The coordination between Turkish intelligence services, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the joint military planning sessions with Russian military officials, and the shared targeting of Israeli assets all demonstrate a level of cooperation that goes far beyond normal diplomatic relations. This is the formation of a military alliance specifically designed to fulfill Ezekiel's ancient warning. The intelligence sharing agreements between Turkey, Iran, and Russia have created an unprecedented level of military coordination. Joint command centers in Damascus and Tehran now coordinate Turkish drone strikes, Iranian missile attacks, and Russian air support in synchronized operations throughout the Middle East. This level of tactical integration represents exactly the kind of military confederation that biblical prophets said would emerge in the last days. The establishment of joint training facilities in Syria demonstrates the practical implementation of this military cooperation. Turkish special forces now train alongside Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Russian Spetsnaz units in combined operations designed specifically for urban warfare in Israeli population centers. The tactical scenarios practiced in these exercises focus on the simultaneous occupation of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. The social and cultural transformation within Turkey provides additional confirmation of the prophetic shift taking place. The systematic removal of Ataturk's secular symbols from public spaces, the increasing emphasis on Ottoman Islamic identity, and the growing hostility toward Christian and Jewish minorities all reflect the kind of religious fanaticism that biblical prophets associated with the end times rebellion against God's chosen people. Turkish schools now teach children that their highest aspiration should be martyrdom in the service of Islamic conquest. Universities have replaced Western philosophy courses with Islamic theology classes that emphasize the religious obligation to wage war against Jews and Christians. The transformation of Turkish education represents a systematic effort to prepare the next generation for what Islamic eschatology calls the final battle. The curriculum changes include detailed instruction in the Islamic laws of warfare, with special emphasis on the treatment of conquered Jewish populations. Students learn that Islamic prophecy promises the complete elimination of Jewish presence from the Middle Quisit for the establishment of global Islamic rule. The systematic dehumanization of Jews in Turkish education represents ideological preparation for genocide. Turkey's betrayal of NATO represents more than strategic realignment. It signals the emergence of a new axis of power that directly challenges the Western-led international order that has maintained relative stability since World War II. The alliance between Turkey, Iran, and Russia creates a geographic and military bloc that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to Central Asia, encompassing some of the world's largest energy reserves and most strategic waterways. The geographic positioning of this alliance perfectly matches the biblical description of the end times coalition. Turkey controls the bridge between Europe and Asia. Iran dominates the Persian Gulf and its energy resources. Russia stretches from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. Together, they control land routes and energy supplies that could strangle both Western economies and Israeli security simultaneously. The recent announcement of joint infrastructure projects connecting the three nations demonstrates the long-term strategic vision driving this alliance. High-speed rail networks will soon connect Istanbul to Tehran and Moscow, creating rapid transportation corridors for both commercial goods and military assets. The integration of telecommunications and banking systems will create an economic bloc independent of Western financial institutions. What this recent political development reveals next will change how you view world events. Turkey's announcement of the Confederation of Believers, a new Islamic military alliance officially dedicated to the liberation of Jerusalem, represents the most direct challenge to Israeli security since the nation's founding in 1948. But more importantly, for those who understand Hebrew prophecy, it represents the fulfillment of warnings that have guided the Jewish people for millennia. The charter document of this Confederation of Believers reads like a page torn from biblical prophecy. It declares the sacred obligation of Muslim nations to unite in military action against the Zionist entity. It establishes joint command structures for coordinated attacks on Israeli territory. It creates shared financing mechanisms for weapons procurement and military training. Most ominously, It includes explicit references to the use of weapons of mass destruction in what the document calls the final cleansing. The military doctrine governing this confederation explicitly rejects the Geneva Conventions and other international laws governing warfare. Member nations pledge to conduct military operations according to what they term prophetic war principles that prioritize religious objectives over civilian protection. The systematic rejection of international humanitarian law represents preparation for the kind of genocidal warfare that biblical prophets warned would characterize the end times assault on Israel. The military intelligence I've obtained about Turkey's preparation for what they call the final jihad reveals planning that goes far beyond regional conflicts. The stockpiling of chemical and biological weapons, the training of suicide battalions, and the construction of massive tunnel networks along the Syrian border all point to preparations for a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. Intelligence reports confirm that Turkish military academies are now teaching courses based on Islamic prophecies about the end times conquest of Jerusalem. Military officers receive instruction in what Turkish generals call prophetic warfare, combining modern military strategy with religious motivation drawn from Islamic eschatology. This represents a fundamental shift from the secular military doctrine that has guided Turkish forces since Ataturk's reforms. The curriculum at the Turkish War College now includes mandatory courses on eschatological warfare and the religious dimensions of strategic planning. These classes teach future Turkish military leaders that conventional rules of warfare do not apply when fighting what they consider to be a divinely ordained campaign against the enemies of Islam. The systematic integration of religious extremism into military doctrine creates a fighting force motivated by apocalyptic fanaticism rather than professional military standards. The training programs include psychological conditioning designed to eliminate moral restraints against civilian casualties. Turkish officers learn that Islamic prophecy specifically requires the elimination of Jewish children to prevent future resistance to Islamic rule. This systematic preparation for genocide represents the most disturbing aspect of Turkey's military transformation. The economic implications of Turkey's Islamic transformation extend into areas that most political analysts haven't fully grasped. The decision to abandon Western financial systems and embrace Islamic banking principles, combined with Iran's oil resources and Russia's natural gas reserves, creates an economic bloc capable of offering a genuine alternative to dollar-dominated global trade. This financial warfare represents exactly the kind of economic upheaval that Hebrew prophets associated with the approach of the end times. The new Islamic financial system being developed by the Turkey-Iran-Russia axis includes provisions for economic warfare against Western nations and Israel. Trade agreements within the Confederation include clauses that prohibit member nations from conducting business with Israeli companies or their international partners. The economic strangulation of Israel represents a key component of the overall strategic plan. The systematic exclusion of Israel from global supply chains has already begun to impact the Israeli economy. Turkish companies that previously conducted significant trade with Israeli firms have terminated all commercial relationships. The boycott extends to third-party companies that maintain business relationships with Israeli entities, creating a cascading effect that threatens to isolate Israel economically before the military assault begins. But what truly reveals the prophetic significance of these developments is the geographic positioning of the coalition members. Turkey controls the bridge between Europe and Asia. Iran dominates the Persian Gulf and its energy resources. Russia stretches from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Together, they control land routes and energy supplies that could strangle Western economies and Israeli security simultaneously. The prophet Ezekiel warned that this coalition would come against Israel when you are living in safety in your land. Many biblical scholars have wondered how this could be possible given Israel's current security situation. But recent developments in Israeli defense technology, including the Iron Dome system and advanced early warning capabilities, have created an unprecedented sense of security among the Israeli population. The stage is being set for the exact scenario Ezekiel predicted. The Iron Dome system has intercepted over 90% of rocket attacks aimed at Israeli population centers. This success rate has created a false sense of security that many biblical scholars believe fulfills Ezekiel's prophecy about Israel dwelling safely when the Great Northern Coalition attacks. The Hebrew phrase used in Ezekiel 38:11, Yashvai Lobatach, describes a people living in confident security, exactly the psychological state that Iron Dome has created among Israelis. The development of Israeli natural gas fields in the Mediterranean has contributed to this sense of security by reducing dependence on energy imports from potentially hostile neighbors. The economic prosperity created by these energy discoveries has led many Israelis to believe that their strategic situation has fundamentally improved. This confidence fulfills the prophetic requirement that Israel be dwelling safely when the coalition attacks. How do you think current military conflicts fulfill Hebrew prophecy? The coordination between Turkish forces and Iranian proxies in Syria, the joint intelligence operations targeting Israeli assets, and the systematic arming of terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East all demonstrate formation of the military infrastructure that would be described in Ezekiel 38 and described the 39. The network of Iranian proxy forces throughout the region now includes Turkish-trained units in Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza. These forces receive advanced weapons and tactical training from Turkish special operations units. The creation of this proxy network provides the coalition with the ability to attack Israel simultaneously from multiple directions, exactly as Ezekiel prophesied. The establishment of Turkish military bases in Qatar and Somalia demonstrates the global reach of this proxy network. Turkish forces now have the capability to coordinate attacks on Israeli interests throughout Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The systematic encirclement of Israel by hostile forces trained and equipped by the Turkey-Iran-Russia axis fulfills the prophetic requirement for a confederation that can attack from all sides. The religious rhetoric accompanying Turkey's military transformation provides crucial insight into the motivations driving these dramatic changes. Erdogan's public prayers for the conquest of Jerusalem, his calls for the restoration of the Islamic Caliphate, and his frequent references to the approaching day of divine judgment all echo themes found in Islamic eschatology about the end times victory over Jews and Christians. Turkish state television now broadcasts programs that explicitly call for the extermination of the Jewish people. These broadcasts use language drawn directly from Islamic prophecies about the end times war against the descendants of apes and pigs. The dehumanization of Jews in Turkish media represents preparation for the genocidal intentions that characterize the Ezekiel 38 coalition. The systematic programming of the Turkish population for genocidal warfare extends beyond media propaganda. Turkish mosques now regularly feature sermons that describe the religious obligation to eliminate Jewish presence from the Middle East. Islamic scholars provide detailed theological justifications for the complete destruction of Israeli society. The religious preparation for genocide represents the spiritual dimension of the military preparations. But here's what biblical scholars find most remarkable about Turkey's transformation. The nation that controls the geographic heart of ancient Togarmah is experiencing exactly the kind of spiritual rebellion that Hebrew prophets said would characterize this people in the last days. The systematic rejection of secular Western values in favor of militant Islamic identity represents a fulfillment of prophetic warnings given 26 centuries ago. The speed of Turkey's spiritual transformation defies conventional political analysis. Within a single generation, Turkey has transformed from a secular Western ally into a militant Islamic state dedicated to the destruction of Israel. This rapid change matches the biblical pattern of sudden spiritual apostasy that characterizes the end times. The Hebrew prophets consistently warned that the final rebellion against God would occur with shocking suddenness. The transformation includes the systematic destruction of Turkey's Christian heritage. Ancient churches have been converted to mosques or destroyed entirely. Christian communities that survived centuries of Islamic rule are now facing systematic persecution and forced emigration. The elimination of Christian presence from Turkey represents preparation for the broader assault on Jewish and Christian populations that Islamic prophecy associates with the end times. The final piece connecting current news to Hebrew prophecy changes everything we thought we understood about the timing of end times events. Turkey's role as the leader of the Islamic Confederation, Iran's function as the primary sponsor of anti-Israeli terrorism, and Russia's position as the military backbone of the coalition perfectly match the prophetic descriptions found in Ezekiel 38. We are not watching random political developments. We are witnessing the precise fulfillment of biblical prophecy. The intelligence analysis I've reviewed suggests that the Turkey-Iran-Russia coalition is preparing for a coordinated attack on Israel within the next 2 to 3 years. The timing coincides with several other prophetic indicators that suggest the end-time sequence is accelerating. The convergence of multiple prophetic fulfillments in such a compressed time frame is unprecedented in human history. The specific timing appears to be connected to the Islamic calendar and prophecies about the approach of the year 1100 in the Islamic system, which corresponds to 2076 in the Western calendar. However, many Islamic scholars believe that the final battles will begin decades before this date, creating a period of tribulation that will culminate in Islamic global dominance. The urgency in Turkish military preparations suggests that the timeline has been accelerated. My friend, what these recent military movements reveal about biblical timing is earth-shattering. The formation of the Turkey-Iran-Russia axis represents the completion of a prophetic puzzle that Hebrew scholars have been assembling for generations. The nation of Togarmah is taking its appointed place in the end times drama, just as the prophet Ezekiel predicted it would. The intelligence community's focus on strategic and economic factors misses the spiritual reality that actually drives these dramatic changes. Turkey's transformation from NATO ally to Islamic powerhouse represents the fulfillment of biblical prophecy about the formation of an end-times coalition against Israel. The same divine providence that scattered the Hebrew people among the nations and then regathered them to their homeland is now positioning their enemies for the final confrontation. As mature political observers who understand both current events and biblical prophecy, we have the responsibility to warn others about what these developments mean for the immediate future. The formation of the Ezekiel 38 coalition, the increasing isolation of Israel, and the systematic undermining of Western power all point to the approaching fulfillment of Jesus' warning that when you see these things beginning to come to pass, know that the kingdom of God is near. The prophet Ezekiel declared that when this great coalition comes against Israel, God himself will intervene to destroy the invading armies. Ezekiel 38:18 through 23 describes supernatural intervention that will leave no doubt about who truly controls the destiny of nations. The same God who made promises to Abraham, who brought the Hebrew people out of Egypt, who regathered them from the four corners of the earth, will once again demonstrate his faithfulness to the covenant people. But this divine intervention will not prevent the conflict from beginning. The coalition of Turkey, Iran, Russia, and their allies will indeed launch their assault on Israel, just as the prophets predicted. The difference is that their defeat will come not from superior Israeli military technology, but from direct divine intervention that will shake the foundations of the earth itself. The biblical description of this supernatural intervention includes earthquakes, fire from heaven, confusion among the attacking armies, and plague that will consume the coalition forces. Ezekiel 38:22 specifically mentions torrential rain, hailstones and burning sulfur falling on the invading armies. This supernatural destruction will be so complete that it will take 7 months to bury the dead and 7 years to burn their weapons for fuel. The geopolitical implications of this prophetic conflict extend far beyond the Middle East. The destruction of the Turkey-Iran-Russia coalition will fundamentally reshape the global balance of power. The elimination of these major military powers will create a vacuum that biblical prophecy suggests will be filled by a Western confederation led by a figure the Bible calls the Antichrist. The aftermath of this supernatural intervention will create conditions for the final phase of biblical prophecy. The destruction of the Islamic coalition will eliminate Israel's primary military threats, creating a period of unprecedented security and prosperity. But biblical prophecy warns that this security will be temporary, setting the stage for an even greater threat from the revived Roman Empire of the end times. The time for speculation has ended. The prophetic clock is ticking, and the events we are witnessing represent the final preparations for the greatest conflict in human history. Turkey's betrayal of NATO and embrace of Islamic Confederation marks a turning point that will reshape the entire global order and fulfill ancient biblical warnings about the approach of the end times. Share your thoughts on how this prophecy relates to current politics. Tell us what political events you see fulfilling ancient Hebrew prophecy. The convergence of biblical warnings and modern geopolitical reality demands our attention and our response. We are living in a generation that will witness the fulfillment of prophecies that have guided the people of God for over 3,000 years. The stage is set. The players are in position. The final act of human history is about to begin.